By the end of this video, you'll understand what a REST API is. At its heart, you can break it down to just two core points. Firstly, representational, meaning the data or resource you want to access can be represented in different formats, for example XML, JSON, HTML, etc. Secondly, state transfer, meaning the condition or state of the client is transferred from the client to the server in an API request, which is where the title REST comes from, Representational State Transfer. There's a lot more to REST, 6 guiding principles in fact, and we'll touch on those in a moment. But you'll understand what's at the core of REST once you grasp these 2 points, representation and state transfer. The quickest way to understand this is to start from the classic browser web server model, where the user types in a URL in a browser to request a web page from a web server. The server responds with HTML, which we can generate a web page from, and that's then displayed in the browser. All designed with a human being, that's you, as the consumer of the resource. Now, to help you understand a REST API, think of the API as a separate or additional program on that web server that provides resources for other computers. This API Endpoint Explorer represents that client computer making a call to an API on the server. What comes back in the response is a text representation of the resource on the server. Let's quickly look under the bonnet and see what's happening between the client and the server. All the information in the initial request and the subsequent response is sent using the HTTP Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And this is a set of rules that both the client and the server work within. And what we send over HTTP can be a REST request or a straightforward request from a browser to a server to get a web page. But data is ultimately what you want to get from the client to the server in the request, and then back from the server to the client in the response. Look at this in your browser. The URL identifies where the resource is located. One of the headers specifies how the resource on the server should be represented when it's returned, and the method tells the server what operation to carry out on that resource. In this instance, we just get the resource. This first key concept to grasp is that the browser, not you, is telling the server how it wants the resource that resides on the server to be represented when it receives it. In text/HTML, because that's the format the browser can turn into a web page that you can then understand. Critical to this is the accept header. This tells the server what type of concept the client will accept and what type of concept the server should send back. It controls essentially the resource or the data on the server and how that should be represented in the response. In this instance, the data from the server is represented in text/HTML, because this is what the browser needs to display the data to you. So where exactly does representation come into it? Let's go back to our Endpoint Explorer that simulates a REST API client. Different client computers may want to see the data represented in different formats, and this can be done using the same accept header we saw being sent by our browser. The header controls how the resource will be represented to the client. Change the accept header and the resource on the server, or rather the representation of the underlying resource, comes back in a different format. The underlying resource on the server could be a file or a record in a database, but the API is said to be RESTful if it can support representing that resource in different formats. So where does state transfer come into it? Well, just quickly, REST was outlined in a dissertation by a guy called Roy Fielding. His dissertation introduces the architectural type for distributed hypermedia systems. Now, Roy came up with 6 principles that should guide the architecture of a RESTful API. And those 6 principles are uniform interface, stateless, cacheable, client-server, layered system, and code on demand. Now, we're not going to go into all of those, but we do want to pick out this stateless principle. We need to store state information for lots of reasons. Take, for example, a simple client application that displays images. And you can navigate through these images with the previous and next buttons. If you're going to click on the next button, something needs to know where you are now in order to work out what comes next. When we're viewing picture 2 and we ask for the next picture, the server needs to know to send picture 3. Now, there's a number of ways you could implement this at an API level, and the two main approaches would involve 1. Storing the client state on the server, 2. Storing the client state within the client. Now, let's just imagine that it's the server that remembers what this state is. This is a perfectly legitimate way to design things, but as we'll see, doesn't conform to our RESTful approach to designing APIs. And all this little client app needs to do is to make a request to the API to get the next image. The client just asks for the next picture. So how does the server know what the next picture is? Well, for that, the server needs to know what picture the client is already looking at, so that the server can send the next picture, which is picture 3. So essentially, the server is storing and recording the current state of the client in order to know what the next picture is. Now, this is not a RESTful API. The server has to remember the client state, which goes against the stateless principle of a RESTful API. So if the server isn't supposed to remember the state, then that means the client must remember the state. And crucially, that client must transfer the state in the requests to the server. So a RESTful API request might look something like this. Get from your host pictures current state 3 next. So this is where the client sends the number 3 in the request, which is essentially the state being transferred from the client to the server. So the server doesn't need to remember the state of the client. The client must send all the information required in each request, which will include the relevant client state information required by the server in order to provide the correct response. Before we wrap up, if you want to learn more about other types of APIs, learn about SOAP in this video, or GraphQL in this video here. In wrapping up and summarising, remember that REST is really about 6 guiding principles. Principles that guide you towards making smart decisions about how you implement an API in a RESTful way. And the 2 important concepts to grasp: representation and state transfer.